It's his first day as Prime Minister. Mark Carney is already facing the U.S. push to absorb Canada. Carney was sworn in late this morning, and within an hour, the U.S. Secretary of State spoke about the president's 51st state obsession while appearing on Canadian soil.
I'll tell you how that came about, okay? He's in a meeting with Trudeau, and Trudeau basically says that if the U.S. imposes tariffs on Canada, Canada couldn't survive as a nation state, at which point the president said, well, then you should become a state. And that's where this began. That said, the president has made an argument for why. He says he loves Canada. He says he made an argument for why Canada would be better off joining the United States from an economic perspective and the like. He's made that argument repeatedly, and I think it stands for itself.
Rubio was in Quebec for the G7 foreign ministers meeting this week. When reporters asked Carney about that better off comment, Carney was blunt.
It's crazy. His point is crazy. That's it.
So does this new cabinet have any new ideas for protecting Canada's security and sovereignty? Bill Blair was sworn in again today as a Minister of National Defence. He's here in the studio. Minister Blair, it's good to see you.
Good to be here.
This is being sold as Canada's new government by the Prime Minister. What is so different about the Carney government from the Trudeau government when you're still in the same job?
Well, I'm in the same job, but I'm on a new team, and it's being led with a new Prime Minister. The focus overwhelmingly is on keeping Canada strong and doing all of the things and it's a very lean cabinet that the Prime Minister has assembled to focus on responding to the economic headwinds that the country faces as a result of the imposition of tariffs, some of the challenges, but also it's very clear, I think that Canada is strong, but there are things that we can do to make it even stronger, to invest in our own workers, to invest in our own industries, to invest in ourselves. And that's the focus of this new cabinet and this new government.
Presumably you were focused on keeping Canada strong before, were you not? I mean, how is that any different than what your focus was under the Trudeau Prime Minister?
Well, I think it's an acknowledgement. First of all, there are certain challenges that are being presented to us as a result of the imposition of tariffs, particularly in our steel and aluminum industry, just as an example. And so some of the conversations that we were having today is focusing, because we're undertaking in the defense sector some pretty significant procurements of large capabilities, new river-class destroyers, the building of armor down in London, Ontario, some of the big infrastructure work that we have to do. We're going to make sure that we invest in ourselves, invest in our workers in our industries, and buy the steel and aluminum required for those jobs right here in Canada.
You know, the Prime Minister has changed and the staff around him will change and the cabinet is shuffled, but the caucus is identical from when Justin Trudeau resigned or announced his departure on the 6th of January. The issue set that was underlying many things, excluding Trump, are still there. I mean, so when Canadians have been looking for change, I mean, Pierre Poilievre was out today reminding Canadians, from his point of view, that it's pretty much the same people with the same problems that they allowed to fester for a number of years.
I think that our government has a new focus under a new leader who's made it very clear about what his priorities are. Those are the priorities of our new cabinet. We had a good discussion about that today. It is responding to the concerns that Canadians have, but also reminding them of the inherent strength of our country. We can do for ourselves what no one else can do for us, and we need to focus on that. I think for a very long time we were perhaps even complacent about our trade diversity and about our existing relationships, and those relationships are now being called into question by the actions of the United States in particular. And it does really call for us to re-examine how we support ourselves, support our workers, our industry, and what we can do for ourselves. And as well, the Prime Minister will be engaging in conversation with some of our closest allies and friends in Europe and France and the United Kingdom over the course of this weekend, and strengthening those relationships. And it is, I think that's the appropriate approach.
Well, you know, a lot of those allies, the United Kingdom, France, and especially the United States, they've complained about the level of defense spending in this country. It's been persistently below the 2% NATO target. You said a month ago you think Canada can get there by 2027. Prime Minister Carney said during the leadership 2030 is a more realistic target because he wants to build domestic production capacity and not just spend money quickly.
And I think that approach is the right one.
So what's the target for this government then?
Well, the target for the government is to make the investments in defense which will result in the capabilities that we require, but also do it in a way that will support and strengthen Canada. And so I will be prepared, as the Government of Canada makes decisions under the direction of our new Prime Minister, as to when we go, how quickly we can go forward. But we are retooling our entire operation in national defence and in the Canadian Armed Forces to be able to respond quickly. And David, I think one of the things that is perhaps our best opportunity is not to go out and purchase in the international markets big shiny new things, but to invest in our own armed forces, invest in our people, invest in the foundations of the Canadian Armed Forces, which is people, our training capacity, the barracks, the housing they live in, for their medical facilities, even things like compensation and benefits. Those are things we can do quickly, and we're going to move on those as rapidly as possible.
No, I get that, but like while Canada is still talking about maybe getting to 2% down the road, the rest of the world's moving on and saying 3.5 is the new target, 5 is the new target.
We are going to 2%. We're going to do it responsibly.
By 27 or 2030, though, because there's a difference in what you said a month ago and a difference in what the Prime Minister has said.
And what I have said to the Prime Minister and the previous Prime Minister, that when the decision is made to go to make the expenditure at that level of spending at 2%, we'll be ready to deliver, and we are putting the plans in place. I think we're working very closely with industry. I've held roundtables with defense industry CEOs right across the country in every sector over the last 2 weeks to ask them how we can work together in partnership to benefit their important work and their workers, but also to deliver for Canadians and the Canadian Armed Forces. And so we're going to develop a new defense industrial policy working in partnership with Canadian industry. And again, I think for a very long time, we went to international markets, and 80% of our large expenditures were actually sourced in the United States. We are recognizing we're going to have to do more for ourselves. That could take a little longer,
right?
But it's the right way to do it.
Okay, I want to touch on the U.S. in just a second, but developing a new defense industrial policy and finding ways to build up domestic capacity, that's not a 2027 timeline then. I take it from what you're saying now and what Prime Minister Carney has said, it's 2030 for 2%. Is that the policy of the Government of Canada right now?
Right now, the Prime Minister has said by 2030, but we are also working, we're dealing with some of the economic challenges. I believe that it's maybe possible for us to make defense investments that will actually help grow our economy, to secure jobs in Canada. And if we can make those investments that actually make Canada stronger, we may be able to accelerate that timeline. Okay,
a big procurement expense that Canada has agreed to is the F-35s from the United States. And yesterday, I believe it was, we saw Portugal's defense minister saying it's no longer going to buy the F-35s from the United States. With the president talking about 51st-state and all of these other things, is it in Canada's best interest to buy a fighter jet from the United States right now? Are you reconsidering the F-35 contract?
I've discussed this with the Prime Minister, and we're also, it's a conversation taking place with the Canadian Armed Forces. Right now, we have undertaken to purchase 88 of the F-35 fighter jets. It was the fighter jet identified by our Air Force as the platform that they required. But we are also examining other alternatives, whether we need all of those fighter jets to be F-35s or if there might be alternatives. The Prime Minister has asked me to go and examine those things and have discussions with other sources, particularly where there may be opportunities to assemble those fighter jets in Canada, to properly support them and maintain them in Canada. And again, we're looking at how do we make investments in defense, which also benefits Canadian workers, Canadian industry, and supports a strong Canadian economy.
Okay, that sounds to me like the F-35 contract is on the table, that some of it, all of it, most of it may not be prosecuted, it may not be completed. You may not buy all the 88 jets if you can find another option.
And the direction I've been given by the Prime Minister is go and look at all of our options to make sure that we make the right decision for Canada.
Okay, so what's the timeline for this, Minister Blair? Because this has been, there is a capacity gap in the Canadian military's ability to patrol, certainly in the Arctic, and the integration with our NATO allies that the F-35s were a part of, and our fleet of jets is older than the Portuguese fleet of jets, so we have a little bit less time. I mean, what kind of a timeline are you talking here for final decision?
And the first 16 of those won't be delivered until 3 years hence.
Right.
And so we're not going to see those F-35s for some considerable period of time. And if we talk about the later portion of that contract, it's out 15 and even 20 years out before they can be delivered and deployable.
But it takes a long time to move on jet acquisition and getting them off assembly lines,
and if we are at least to consider, and we're going to consider other options where we can accelerate the delivery of other capabilities. And again, I am not ending the F-35 contract or even calling it into question, but I think it's entirely responsible to look and see if that's the right investment for us or whether we can make other investments that will benefit Canadian workers, industry, and our economy.
I know you're not ending it, but with all due respect, Minister, saying the Prime Minister has asked me to look at other options, that is calling it into question. That, I mean, wouldn't it be enormously expensive to break it?
And again, David, I had this conversation with our Prime Minister today.
Yeah.
He said, go and do the homework. And so we'll do the homework, and I have a lot of things I have to consult with our Air Force and with the Chief of Defense, with our Department of National Defense, but also with our allies and partners to see what is possible. And based on that homework, we'll determine the right course of action for the Canadian Armed Forces and what's right for Canada. I think we are being compelled to look at options that might be necessary.
European
to keep
options?
Canada strong. Well, again, I'm not going to limit that discussion, but there was a great deal of work that was done in the past on what could work, and there are a number of options that met our requirements, and so that's a good place for us to begin. But again, there's a lot of work to do. The Prime Minister asked me to look into this today, and we're certainly going to undertake that, because I think it is incumbent upon us in all of these large expenditures. It's a lot of money that we're investing in new military capabilities, that we should do it to make sure that, first of all, our armed forces receive exactly the equipment, the capabilities that they require, but we do it in a way which strengthens the Canadian economy and supports Canada's national interests, not just in defense, but in our economic interests as well.
But look, you know the headline, and that is going to come from these comments you have made. You know the clips that are going to be played and how these are going to be perceived. It sounds like, you know, the Carney government is looking at getting out of the F-35 contract if they can find an option that's
David,
better for them.
And David, let me just be very clear with you then. No one has suggested to me get out of that contract. That's not what I'm talking
But
about.
look at an option that could be better than the F-35.
So I've been asked to consider all of the options and come back to the Prime Minister with a recommendation for the best way forward. That will involve significant consultation with our allies in NORAD and NATO, consultation certainly with our Air Force Command and our Chief of Defense and our industry partners. But I think it's always incumbent upon us, before we make these very significant investments that are going to take 20 years to realize, before we make those significant investments, that we constantly reevaluate to make sure it's the right option for Canada. And that new option has to consider what's also right for Canadians, Canadian workers, industry, and our economy.
So it sounds like you could go through this process and come to the conclusion the F-35 is still the way to go.
Absolutely. And that is a very real possibility. And like I said, the fact that the Prime Minister said, go and look into this to make sure that it's still the right decision for Canada, that's entirely his responsibility and my responsibility to fulfill that. We'll do that work, and we'll report back to him and eventually to Canadians as to the outcome of that.
Okay, one last question because I've gone over time. But if you're reconsidering or re-examining, re-evaluating the jet purchase, and if you're looking at building domestic industrial policy and not getting to 2% until 2030, some of the capacity challenges in the Canadian military will linger. Ukraine is looking for security guarantees, of which Canada has committed to. The Americans may not. Can you deliver on what you need to deliver for Ukraine, should there be a peace, on this timeline in a way that's meaningful?
Yes, I believe that's possible. Of course, our CDS has been involved with the Chief of Defenses from all the countries which are among the coalition of the willing to provide support and security guarantees to Ukraine. We already have almost 650 Canadian Armed Forces members who are training the Ukrainian forces spread all across Canada and Europe. And our ability to consolidate that and to focus that effort, I think, gives us all sorts of opportunities. And at the same time, we have a large commitment of personnel into Latvia. But last year, as a result of some very important changes that the new CDS has brought forward in the work of the Canadian Armed Forces, we hired nearly 2,000 more people this year than left our organization. That's the first significant increase in personnel. We're on a very strong upward trajectory. We're increasing our training capacity. We're onboarding more people. We're building the infrastructure that is necessary to support them. I believe that Canada can meet its commitments that we've articulated today, but we're going to grow into those commitments as well because we need more from our armed forces.
Okay, Minister of National Defense, Bill Blair, thanks for being here on a busy day, sir.
Thanks
Appreciate
very much,
your time. U.S. President Donald Trump continued to emphasize the importance of his tariffs as a way to address fentanyl coming into the United States.
As soon as I put on the tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, unbelievable results have been seen in the last few weeks. Unbelievable results. They weren't happy about it. You probably read they weren't happy, but they are working like hell to end it. They weren't working very hard before I did that.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave a different defense for other tariffs on steel and aluminum imports and further reciprocal tariffs expected in April.
This is not meant to be hostile towards anybody. It is meant to be friendly and supportive of our of our national interest as a country. Once the baseline of trade is reset in a way that's fair and equitable, then we can engage in the process of bilateral negotiations with individual countries, including our allies, to set up a more sustainable and fair long-term trade arrangement between our respective countries.
Yesterday, federal ministers Dominic LeBlanc and François-Philippe Champagne, along with Ontario Premier Doug Ford, met with U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick in Washington to discuss those tariffs. They all characterized the meeting as good and constructive. David Paterson is Ontario's representative in Washington, D.C., and he joins us now. David Paterson, it's good to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, David. It's good to see you, too.
I haven't seen Doug Ford that happy since election night. He came out and said it was a very positive, the best meeting he's had in Washington. What made this so positive?
Yeah, it was a chance to sort of bring the temperature down and to build relationship, and most important, to sort of build understanding, both two-way understanding, but really for us to listen and understand clearly what Secretary Lutnick and also USTR lead Jamieson Greer are looking to accomplish and why. And I think on your show and others, there has been an endless kind of speculation on what does Trump want. And
Right.
What made us feel good is to get from the direct source a good indication of that and what they're trying to achieve from their perspective. Whenever you're in a tough situation like this, you really want to understand what your either business opponent or others are trying to achieve and put yourself in their shoes. And yesterday was that, because of the relationship between Doug Ford and Secretary Lutnick. And we were able to also invite Dominic LeBlanc and Ambassador Hillman to join us, and because, of course, they're responsible for trade.
Right.
But really built off of the relationship with Doug Ford, we were able to really, I think, make some progress in understanding each other a lot better.
So what is it you understand it to be? Because it is difficult to understand the U.S. position when Donald Trump talks about fentanyl, he talks about migration, he talks about annexation, he talks about trade deficits, he talks about military spending. What is your understanding from Howard Lutnick and Ambassador Greer now on what it is the Americans want in all of this?
Yeah, we had a 90-minute meeting, and I'd say the first half hour was a masterclass from Howard Lutnick in a very calm and straightforward and logical way in terms of why the United States is taking on some of the things. We in Canada start that understanding with tariffs, but let's back up. What they are facing, and the focus of the U.S. government, is to deal with a $2 trillion a year deficit in their federal spending, which is crisis level, and they will admit that. And so to deal with that, there are a handful of important things that are happening. There's a major tax bill in Congress that I've been working with Republicans to understand, and it's something that must not increase that deficit further while keeping tax levels and competitiveness low. Secondly, the DOGE, which Howard Lutnick, of course, ran the transition team and created the DOGE. And
Right.
that is a very difficult and challenging thing, but an important thing to get costs under control, sort of what we dealt with in the Martin Kretchen years on steroids.
Just for
And
people
then
listening, the DOGE is the Department of Government Efficiency, which is Elon Musk's initiative to cut costs in the U.S. government. Sorry to interrupt. Just want the audience to follow.
No,
Go ahead.
exactly.
Yeah.
One person's cuts is another person's efficiencies, but it's really hard. And then the third is tariffs. And what was made clear to us is that we have to take on this serious challenge with serious measures. Tariffs will be part of that, not just as a revenue source from a global application of tariffs, but also as a way, of course, to attract investment into the United States. We'd like to see both of those things. We're very clear that's what we're trying to do. The president, Lutnick, have put it in plain sight. If you want to understand what they want, that's what they want. They want to slay that that massive deficit, and they want to apply new revenue sources.
So that, to me, David, that makes it sound like tariffs are inevitable, right? That there's going to be tariffs of some form at the Canada-U.S. border because they want the money from that, full stop, period.
Tariffs are now a global policy of the United States. And this is a historic change to global trading patterns. And they're very aware of that, very straightforward. They will be applying tariffs on an industrial basis, in other words, by sector, across countries all around the world on April 2nd. And this is new. This is different, doesn't align with a lot of trade agreements, and a lot of people will be very upset with it, but it will be US policy. And they said, I want you to understand that, but we also want you to understand that after that, the countries that get along with us the best, that are allies, that are able to help us grow our economy, will be first in line to be able to adjust or to mitigate or to be able to address that. So it's happening on the 2nd. Be prepared. But know that we understand the integration of our economies. We understand the value of Canada. And so they point us in the direction of others like the UK and Mexico and Australia in terms of how they would prefer to see a reaction to this. But they respect that we will react and protect ourselves in the ways that we want. They respect that our economy situation is different than those. But this is the policy. This is the way they're going forward. And I think yesterday gave us a lot of clarity that that's the case. And as Secretary Lutnick said, it really helps us when you say, look, I get it.
Right. So it sounds like, if I can simplify this and make sure I'm understanding it correctly, and please correct me if I'm not, they're going to do this, and they're going to do this to absolutely everybody, no matter who you are. What happens after they do this on April 2nd, there may be a quicker off-ramp for a country like Canada because of the various relationships and trade agreements. But we have to live with the hit on April 2nd and then find a cooperative way forward after that to mitigate whatever it is the U.S. puts in place. Am I sort of understanding? I'm not saying you're advocating for this, but this is your understanding from being in that meeting.
That's correct. And just one additional aspect on that is that applying tariffs on the whole world is extremely difficult to do because, they have this thing called the HS codes, which tracks every little bit and piece from everywhere in the world. So they're going to take, instead of a comprehensive approach, they will likely approach this in an industrial way. So for example, we have, as everyone knows, recently had the application of 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, and it's extremely worrisome and anxiety driven for us in Canada. I think we will see the rest of the world catching up in some of that as well. I hope it's not additive to what we're doing. We don't know for certain, but there will be other sectors as well. But it won't be comprehensive in all kinds of ways. We understand, and then we can start tomorrow to have a discussion around what are our unique circumstances in North America. Where do we help you from a military point of view, from an economic point of view, from a supply chain point of view? Where are our businesses, your businesses, and how should we think about mitigating or preventing unintended consequences between us? And so it was a very straightforward and honest discussion. It was, I think, very helpful. We had the federal ministers with us to be able to sort of absorb that, because ultimately it's the federal government that must deal with trade. And then as for the USMCA, I think that's further down the line after we deal with these types of steps. So back to Premier Ford, it really helps to understand and to be in conversation, understand what you're doing, and then you can make some decisions. And so we retain all the ability to resume charges on electricity and all those kinds of things. But I think what we wanted to do only was listen, understand, and we brought down the temperature. The market went up. I consider that a good day.
So it sounds like with this new understanding, and Doug Ford was asked repeatedly by Katie Simpson afterwards whether the electricity tax will go back on, and he definitely heard her because, it's Katie Simpson, and I say that with great affection and respect. She is heard when she wants to be heard. He didn't want to answer it. It sounds to me like you're not going to do that because of this new understanding and a reset in the rhetoric and the relationship, and try to move forward on an understanding for a post-April 2nd world. Am I understanding the position as of right now?
I would say that the proper way to say it is that we reserve the ability to resume all of those things and any other things, as do other provinces. the provincial participation in things is something quite new
Right.
in trade, so we have an excellent rapport within the Council of Federation between provinces, and we're all sort of complementary in terms of the things that we can do. But I think this was valuable information, and again, it's, if you perceive an opponent, maybe they're trying to work through some of their own problems first. You may not like that, but it's really valuable to understand it.
No,
and to understand what's coming.
This has been very helpful in helping my understanding. So we're getting tight on time, so I have to ask this question. I mean, Doug Ford has just gotten his new mandate, Howard Lutnick, and then we'll be there for another while. We can see that relationship there. We've got a reset happening at the federal level. The consensus is still to retaliate and fight, right? So what's your sense of how that is perceived in the U.S. and whether the change from Prime Minister Trudeau to Prime Minister Carney helps in any way in dealing with the Trump administration?
I think it's important for us always to understand that the scale of the United States in the world is a little different than us, and the perspective when you're living in Washington is a little bit different in that regard. It's the old adage that it's not that they don't think of us; they don't think of us at all. So drawing attention and making it all about you is sometimes seen as being not understanding the plot of what the United States is trying to do.
Right.
So I'm not buying or selling on that. Our politicians and our next federal government is going to need to decide how to approach that. But again, yesterday was positive, and I think markets and other things, I'm not saying there's a causal relationship, but I think there was a lot of reduction of tension. There was a lot of improvement of understanding, and I will be following up as one part of that next week with some further discussion so that we can help mitigate any of the things that we anticipate could be hurtful both in the United States as well as Canada. And that's maybe a positive next step.
David Paterson, we'll want to talk to you probably next week after that meeting. That's Ontario's representative in Washington. Appreciate the time and the insight, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, David.